Hello, and welcome to ClayEnglish. Today I invite my teacher and friend Yan to do a mock Ielts test. I am the examiner and Yan will be the candidate. Okay, let's begin. Now, in the first part, I'd like to ask you some questions about yourself, okay? Let's talk about family. Do you have a large family or small family?
Yeah, I have a very small family compared to historic family sizes, although perhaps in modern times having any children at all is unusual. So I have a wife, I have two children, and my parents have sadly died. My grandparents died before them, of course. And I have one older sister who is married and she has three children and three grandchildren. She lives a long way away from me, so I haven't seen her for a long time. My family here in China is my wife and my youngest child, who's a baby now, 15 months old. While in England, my older child is just about to be 28. It's his 28th birthday in a few weeks' time. So my family is, I would say, very small.
Can you tell me something about them?
Yeah, my wife is an author and writer, and she does reviews online. She's been self-employed for many years doing that. My son in England is a landlord. He has a couple of properties, rents them out to tenants. My father was an engineer for many years, and halfway through his working life, he switched to becoming a senior lecturer in a university in England and became a specialist in teaching management, the Diploma of Management Studies. My mother was a housewife for most of her life. And towards the end, after I left home, she got a part-time job working in various shops as a shop assistant. My sister was working for many different companies over the years as a secretary or personal assistant. And her last job before retirement was working in a book company as a PA for the managing director. And they were book publishers. Okay.
Okay. How much time do you manage to spend with members of your family?
Being retired, I can stay at home with my wife and my youngest son most of the time. We spend most of the time together here in China. But my son in England, I can only keep in touch with at the moment via Skype, 2 phone calls a week. And we hope to go and visit him now that the COVID restrictions are lifted. It's easier to travel. And so we hope to visit him in England later this year.
What sorts of things do you like to do together?
Yeah, different things with different people. My son in England likes to go traveling, likes to play table tennis. My wife and I, we like to go traveling as well. And now my son is old enough to go with us. Is my young son here, that is. So he enjoys traveling as well, seeing new places. But most of the time we spend around the apartment or very close to the apartment in the parks and play areas near us. Okay.
Do you get on well with your family? Why?
Well, with my wife and children, mostly yes. With my son in England, because of the distance and the fact he is on his own, this has caused some problems with communication. But generally speaking, I think the relationship's working okay. It's different with my sister. I think since my father died about 5 years ago, we haven't really had any communication. That's sad. So perhaps when we go back to England, I can try and reestablish contact with her.
Now, I am going to give you a topic. I'd like you to talk about it for 1 to 2 minutes. Before you talk, you will have 1 minute to think about what you are going to say. You can make notes if you wish. Do you understand? Here is some paper and pencil for making notes. And here is your topic. I'd like you to describe a teacher who has influenced you in your education. All right? Remember, you have 1 to 2 minutes for this. So don't worry if I stop you. I'll tell you when the time is up. Can you start speaking now, please?
Okay, for the purpose of these mock tests, we won't wait the minute to give me time to prepare. We'll go straight into the test, and we're not going to actually time the talk, but I'll go through a possible answer to this question, and this will hopefully take more than 2 minutes, and then you can pick the useful bits yourself. So I will go into my answer. For the purpose of today's question, I've picked a teacher from my law school. And when I decided to retrain as a lawyer in my mid 40s, I went back to law school, London Metropolitan University, where the course tutor was a guy called Barry. And he was a retired barrister, if you can call it retired. He'd been a former barrister and he had switched, as many barristers do, into lecturing. So I met Barry at the London Metropolitan University, where I was taking my conversion course to become a law graduate. And Barry was the course tutor on the what's called the CPE, or Postgraduate Diploma of Law. And he taught contract law, the law of obligations. And I remember his first lecture, and he asked the class a question, and there appeared to be only two answers, true or false, and half the class said true, half the class said false, and Barry said, "You're all wrong. The question in law has an answer of it depends. You can't make a judgment based on the information I've given you. It's too soon, it's too limited. You mustn't jump to conclusions." And this initial statement was very memorable, and I still remember it today. And Barry, throughout the course, focused on inspiring us to challenge the law, to look at the cases from both sides, to think about law in a different way, to be creative, to cross fertilize, to look for meanings in other areas which you could apply in the case in front of you. And he was extremely good at motivating us and getting us excited. And prior to going to law school, I had been to some extent frightened by the possibility of the what's called the Socratic way of teaching in law school, where you pick on a student and ask them a series of questions in rapid fire motion to try and get them to think quickly, like in court. And Barry was good at this, but it was um, motivating to prepare to be answering in this way. And I really enjoyed the challenge, and it made me a better lawyer at the end of it, because a lawyer who only knows the law is not much of a lawyer. And Barry helped us to think outside of the box and be much more than just a lawyer. So I have a great positive memory of that. Next
We
question.
have been talking about a teacher who has influenced you in your education. I'd like to discuss with you some more general questions relating to this topic. First, let's consider developments in education. How has education changed in your country in the last 10 years?
I think it's better to look at the changes over a longer period because I'm 64. I was at school some 50 years ago, and my son is now 28. He was at school around 10 to 15 years ago. So I can compare his experience of education with my experience. And I think there's several obvious things that have changed. Firstly, the quantity of information, the things to learn have decreased, have declined over the time. The course I studied was much more in depth, many more facts to learn, a lot more information to absorb and digest compared with my son's experience 10 years ago. The second thing is the type of subjects, the way things are taught has changed. When I was at school, they were much more useful and meaningful, particularly history. When I was at school, we learned the history of the entire period in a consistent and joined up manner. So we could follow the developments from the Roman Empire through to the Middle Ages and World Wars One and Two in the 20th century. And we were taught up to 1939. We stopped at the beginning of the World War Two, but we had a look at the causes. My son didn't have any of this kind of joined up history education. It was bits and pieces, history of the Wild West in America, the history of medicine were two of the topics I recall. So not very useful. And the third major change is the way that subjects are tested. When I was at school, everything was closed book exams. That means you had to memorize, you had to cram the night before the exam to learn as much as possible and then regurgitate it onto the exam paper the next day. In modern times, it's moved over to what's called continual assessment. That means you get marks for submitting homeworks all the way through the year. There might be a project to work on, which contributes to the final mark. And that means, unfortunately, that students may well do very well and cover a wider range and a deeper coverage of a subject, but not actually know it. Because unless you have to commit it to memory, for a closed book exam, you never have to actually know it. You know, if it's an open book exam, you take your textbooks in, you just look for the answer and copy it out onto the exam paper. That's not really testing people's knowledge. Okay, next question.
What changes do you foresee in the next 50 years?
I think the biggest change in education is the use of the internet, particularly things like ChatGPT, which answer questions for you and save you having to actually go looking on the internet for information. And so the way people are going to be tested must change. The way homework is handled must change. And yeah, this can work both ways. So the advantages of the internet for teaching are obvious to me. For example, the wide range of information that's out there. It's a living, breathing, growing encyclopedia. But of course, it's good and bad, full of truths and lies, fake news, and so on. And filtering through all of that will need a guide. But once you've been shown how to use the internet and effectively shown how to learn, then you can find out the answers to anything by searching yourself. And I think that teaching in this way will change. And I think we'll see a lot more of pre recorded lectures so that they can be prepared perfectly, like our Clay English videos are so perfect. We do hundreds and hundreds of retakes in order to get exactly the perfect video to show to our students. And this information can be stored online. And so I foresee in the future, in the next 50 years, Clay English will be the number one education resource for the entire universe, particularly in English teaching. And this will be because our videos can be shown to anyone, anywhere, rather than you having to go to a classroom and sit there in silence while a substandard teacher gives a poor version of this lecture to their students. And instead, you have the option to come to us at Play English and see the best of the best production, the best lecturers, the best examiners recorded forever online, and you can see it anytime, anywhere. I think the Clay English takeover of the education system will be the biggest change for the next 50 years.
Okay, let's talk about the national education system. How do expectations of today's school leavers compare with those of the previous generation?
Yeah, I think expectations generally increase over time. I think the competition between school leavers is continually increasing to get into the best jobs, the best universities, to do the best degrees. These are competitive pressures which are felt more and more on school leavers. One of the big problems with education is how you actually measure whether it's successful or not. And so more and more focus is placed on exams and exam results, and particularly the last exam in China, the Gaokao. In England, it's A levels, which are the final exam before leaving school and going to university. So there's a lot more pressure as the publicity around these exam results goes higher and higher, and the consequences of a bad exam result can be felt throughout people's career afterwards. So even though only about half of school leavers go to university, the pressure is for all school leavers to try and get the best exam results they can to get into the best university. And the definition of what it means to be the best university has changed over time. People's intentions and direction has changed as to where they want to go and what they want to do, which university course they want to go into. And for me, it's really sad that the focus is on exam results rather than on ultimate career success, because that's what really matters is, are you able in your career after leaving education to be successful, and how we measure that. And it's not just money, it's not just your earnings, but also how happy you are. And that depends on relationships. And successfully having a family and having children is a much better measure of success than simply how much money you have. But with the focus on education and the focus on careers, people staying longer and longer in education, trying to get masters and PhDs in order to increase their opportunities, perceived opportunities in the workplace afterwards. And that delays their attempts to have families while they are still in the education system. And it's questionable whether that's good for society and whether it's good for people, because life is about families and children, not about exam results. And unfortunately, the expectations for young people today has changed away from having families and onto having careers, and the balance between these two has gone, in my opinion, too far the wrong way. And that's one of the reasons why the birth rate in all developed countries is collapsing, because young people are focusing on careers and not families. Okay.
Okay, what role do you think extracurricular activities play in education?
Yeah, it depends on the subject. And there's two types of subject, really. There's what's called compulsory topics, which are going to be tested in the exams, and then optional topics, which you do for fun. And the balance between these two is what makes childhood interesting and fun. And in the West, the school day is much shorter than in China. And so young people have much more time for extracurricular activities than in China. And quite often they will do play games. I mean, I think that even in China, the number one extracurricular activity is playing computer games, and you can understand this after a stressful day at school. The last thing you want to do is socialize. Perhaps you want to just relax on the sofa playing a computer game with some kind of handheld device. But no, nevertheless, the principle of extracurricular activity is to enhance and enrich the students' development, and to give them an awareness of things outside the educational curriculum, which is quite narrow, is designed by the government to give people the basic skills for modern life as an adult. That's the theory, at least. And so there are many other things which you don't learn at school, which were still uh, of value in real life, but also can be fun and interesting. If you are good, for example, at sport, you might enjoy playing weiqi or go outside school because that's something you're good at and enjoy, and you can push yourself in a non-education oriented manner towards achieving awards or success in other activities. But you have to remember at all times not to allow these activities to distract from the primary goal of getting good exam grades at the end of your educational year. So it's a balancing act for parents, particularly, to decide what is and isn't a good extracurricular activity outside school. So good in the sense of developing the child, but not too distracting from the primary purpose of education. So it's an important balance to play. Okay.
Okay, let's talk about different styles or methods of teaching and learning. What method of learning works best for you?
Yeah, it depends what I'm learning, what kind of subject. But generally, self-study is better than going to a lecture. I really hate sitting in a classroom with my mouth shut and listening. My mind wanders after about 10 or 15 minutes. So it has to be interactive. The teacher has to ask questions of the students. There has to be communication both ways to keep both people awake, as far as I can see. Unidirectional lecturing is so boring, and I really don't think it's a good idea. Having said that, watching videos online can be a good way of learning, as long as they're not too long, as long as they're concise and focused, because you can rewind and watch it again if you miss something. And also, there's subtitles, so if the person doesn't have a clear voice, or indeed if it's being translated, you can understand what they're saying. So I think that there is a role for that. Depends on the topic. For learning a language, there's many different ways of learning it, and it depends on your level, of course. So, really, the best way of learning a language is one to one. As a beginner, you need somebody who is a native of your country who has a bit of knowledge of the foreign language. So, in China, the best way of teaching beginners English is with a Chinese teacher. And the reason is obvious because the teacher will spend more time explaining the words, explaining the meaning, explaining the grammar in Chinese than actually speaking English. But as your English level develops and so you become an advanced student, then the best way of learning is through things like ClayEnglish. You need to watch or interact with a native speaker who ideally is speaking really good English and can help you and give feedback on your errors. And that's how I help students here in Quimming, for example, at my English corner. But only advanced students. I can't teach beginners. It's not the best way for beginners to learn a language. So self-study, self-education is usually the best because you're motivated to learn what you need. You can search on the internet, find the best source and compare them and then learn what you need to do, what you need to know. I don't like fixed courses. The reason for attending courses is for the piece of paper at the end, the qualification, the certificate, the license. Otherwise, we wouldn't bother because in real life, you actually need to search on the internet for the answers. You don't need necessarily to know everything. You just need to know where to look to find the answers. So for me, self-study is generally the best. Okay.
How beneficial do you think it is to group students according to their level of ability?
Yeah, I think this is the big problem with standardized education is that you have a mixed range of abilities in the same class, and therefore the class proceeds at the speed of the slowest. So the most intelligent kids will get bored, will mess around, misbehave, and ultimately be excluded from class. This is not a good use of time. So I think this is absolutely crucial. Classes should be divided, ideally as small as possible, and ideally with as close a level of ability matching, however you do that, and for each subject. And so somebody could be in the top group for, let's say, maths, and in the bottom group for, let's say, history, and that's no problem because people are um, differently equipped for different subjects and different ability in different subjects. And so you don't have to have students in the top class for everything just because they're mostly good at most things. But it's about what I think is child-centered learning, what works for the children, what works best for an individual child. And that means individual customization of education, which is not possible in a standardized national state education system. So private education in small classes would work much better as long as you're grouped with people of similar ability. And small groups work better than large groups, of course. And what that means is that the high level people will move much more quickly through the syllabus and also be able to do much more difficult, wide ranging ability topics than perhaps lower ability people. So there will be a need for the lower ability students to get up to a minimum level, of course, but you really need to focus on the top level students. When you look at the people who changed the world, it's the top 1%, maybe 0.1% of IQ people that are really going to shake up the world. And these people need to be given a special education from a very early age because standardized education is just going to make them bored. And these people will be the movers and shakers of the next generation. So you've got to give them a special education, special motivation, give them special treatment because they are going to make the world a better place in the future if you can do that. Okay.
Thank you very much. That is the end of the speaking test.